So today we're going to be covering the reopening surveys that the CWA has been putting out and the results from the most recent one that wrapped up in late July. We'll also be launching our next reopening survey towards the end of this week to capture the end of August data, and we'll be sending that link out a little bit later this week. So once you get a hold of that, make sure you fill that out and send that back to us. Um, After we cover that data, we'll have a little chance for a chat, question and answer period, maybe some breakout rooms, and then I'll give you guys a little glimpse at our upcoming Survive and Thrive workshop that we'll be having next week. Um, so our ground rules, as always, are going to be just be polite and respectful with everybody that's on the call. We'll have a lot more chance for dialogue at this particular call. So you'll be able to unmute and mute yourself as you wish. Feel free to use that chat for anything you don't want to say out loud. And you also still have the raise hand feature and a couple other fun little icons that you can surface. Keep any personal political commentary out of this. Some of the survey data we'll cover goes a little bit more broadly outside of the climbing industry as well. Um, but let's keep it as close to our specific interests as possible. When you are speaking out loud, please try to just limit those comments to around 2 minutes. That way, everyone gets a chance to speak. Anyone who is abusive will have to remove you. As always, still have never had to exercise that, and hopefully we never do. Um, so I'll just dive right in, and perhaps we'll wrap this call up a little bit more shortly, unless you guys have a lot of questions. And to start with, I was just going to give a real broad overview where we're at in the U.S. Most of the world, the vast majority of the world's reopened completely. Canada at this point, most of Europe. In the U.S., we still have two states that have never had the chance to reopen. Those are North Carolina and Michigan. They've been closed ever since March. Really tough for those guys. And then we've had a couple states that have reclosed, California and Arizona specifically. Right now, we've got about 72% of the gyms in the US open and doing business. It's pretty flat from last month where we had about 70%. So a few more folks have been able to reopen. Most notably, New York City's, New York parts of New York State that have been closed are going to have the option to reopen coming up pretty shortly. So I would expect those guys to start getting back into gear at the end of this month and early September. So coming up pretty quick now. I was going to start with one of the high level things in our survey, which is just the sentiment of gym owners out there in our industry, and really similar to small business owners across a huge variety of different industries, with maybe some possible exceptions in some of the really high end professional services. Um, for us and what we've seen as the CWA are some interesting trends over the last few months. So this question that we're looking at here is whether you felt as an owner you were in danger of going out of business in May. Well, people were we were doing that survey just coming off of all of the shutdowns. At that point, we only had about 15 to 20% of the gyms in the U.S. open, so a lot of people hadn't had the chance to open their doors yet. And there was a much more, it seemed like a much more existential threat that people were facing, where if they weren't going to be able to get their doors open at all, what are they going to do to make it through the end of the year, basically. Once June rolled around and people had the chance to reopen and customers started coming in, we saw some pretty big changes in those numbers, and people starting to get a better feel for where they're at. We still saw about 30% of people unsure of what their future status was. They weren't quite able to at least as they reported in the survey, not able to grasp exactly what the threats are and how serious or imminent any closures, permanent closures might be, such as going out of business. And then I think we saw that trend continue in July, where more people started feeling the pressures of limited occupancy, not as many customers returning as they would have liked to see. Um, and at the same point, we did see a number of people who started to feel like, no, I'm not going to go out of business. I think I can make it through to the end of the pandemic, which of course no one knows when that is. But we would generally advise to be planning like a minimum for 6 months from now, maybe a maximum even up to like 18 months, somewhere in that range. It seems pretty likely as far as I can read the tea leaves out there of what's going on in the U.S. Probably a little better prognosis for some of our international members in terms of getting over the most severe humps of this pandemic. Um, Also saw pretty similar reporting between gyms that are open and gyms that are currently closed. So this is all from our July survey, and I split these into two different categories where we had gyms where either all of their locations or at least some of their locations were open, and then gyms who either have been forced to close for the entire pandemic or gyms who have reclosed, such as California and Arizona. And you can see that the number of people who are unsure and who don't think they're going to have an issue is pretty stable, and those track pretty well with previous months as well. Where we do see a larger fear among our owners is gyms who either have not been able to open or who have had to reclose. They do feel that really immediate, pressing um, uh, issue, existential threat of if they can't get their doors back open, they're not quite as sure how long they're going to be able to hold in there. Um, And this data really isn't too dissimilar from the rest of the U.S. Once you start looking at other industries and then more broadly, I've been paying a lot of attention to the McKinsey company, who's been putting a lot of COVID market research out publicly, which has been very helpful. Uh, they Depending on the survey and data that they're putting out, it'll be broken down by various types of industries. We generally will fall in that arts, entertainment, and recreation portion. So you can see that similar to what we saw with our members in the indoor climbing industry, about 20% roughly of folks are not too worried about going out of business permanently, going bankrupt, anything negative like that. Somewhere around 30% are just unsure. There isn't enough data to go on for them, or they're not sure how to crunch that data to make a decision. And if you're looking at that 1 year, 6 month to 18-month time frame, you generally have around 40 to 50% of people that are very worried that they're not going to be able to make it through that time period. Um, So in our industry, we've seen some pretty big impacts on revenue. Some of the numbers we put out in our survey, I think, were alarming to folks. And there are a big variety of circumstances out there. So um, one of the big stark differences, which everyone might expect, is that the revenue for a gym that's been closed versus a gym that's been able to reopen and stay reopened is pretty massively different. You're about 9.5%, 10% for gyms that have been forced to close of the revenue they would expect at this time last year, and about 42% for gyms that have been able to reopen and get customers back in the door. One thing that's notable about this, these are averages. So, I'd say for like a modal value, so like the most common revenue that's reported to us is right in between like 50 and 60%, maybe 55% to split the difference. So, the most common number we hear from gym owners that have responded to our surveys is that they're about 55% of revenue. Um, we've had some reports that are in the 90s and high 80s, which is amazing. Quite a number of folks in the 70s, but that total average is brought down quite a bit by folks that are stuck in the 25, 20%, 30% range. So once you start getting all of the data together, it starts to look a little more depressing than it might for certain operators. And uh, hard to tell like what the causes of that are. Definitely looking at the data we have available to us to see if there's any information we can provide you guys on how best to look at that. Um, but to break that revenue number down a little bit more, if we look at kind of the general top line sales for gyms, the total check-ins, and then splitting that into day passes, punch passes, and memberships. We see a pretty big decline across the board for these, and these are percentages of these different um, channels as compared to the same time last year. So for a gym with 100 check-ins a day, July 2019, there are about 41 check-ins per day in 2020. Um, so you can see that there's a really interesting, very linear comparison between these numbers and then the revenues that we're seeing from folks. There are some alternative revenue streams that people are capitalizing on. We've seen an uptick in retail. Back in March, April, gyms were telling us that about 15% or so were using retail as an additional revenue stream. That's up to about 30% at the moment with this last July survey. People are getting other creative ideas around different classes, whether online or in person, that they can offer if they can outdoors. And we saw a big uptick in July for revenue coming from youth programs. So there's very clearly a return to day camps, summer camps, team sports, things of that nature. And again, these numbers are very, very close to what we're seeing in other industries and just in the country as a whole. This company, Biz2Credit, did a review of several hundred, I think it was a little over 300 businesses who had been granted PPP loans, of which our industry is a pretty heavy user. According to our July data, almost 70% of climbing gyms have applied for and been granted PPP loans, and right around 50% were granted EIDL or emergency loans. All of those programs are still, or many of those programs are still available, but that landscape's changing pretty rapidly, and it'll be interesting to see what happens with the fires and hurricanes and everything else that 2020 is throwing at all of us here in the U.S. So if you haven't taken advantage of any of those programs yet, definitely get in touch with your bank or directly with the SBA and see what's available to you at this point in time. But getting back to this slide and comparing the climbing industry to the broader U.S. small business landscape, we're very, very similar. Again, I said, the general modal value that we see in terms of revenues, people are making about 55% of what they did at the same time last year. These companies surveyed, that revenue is about 48% of what they would have seen last year. So at least for what's reported to us, we're trending a little bit higher than the overall economy. And these companies that applied for the PPP loans, which for those of you who haven't gone through that entire process yet, is heavily based on your payroll. So for these companies that were granted PPP loans, they did see a 54% drop in their payroll expenses as well. And I think that's going to be something that we don't see quite as heavily in the indoor industry. Most of the gym owners in the U.S. And respondents to our surveys have really retained quite a lot of staff. Um, uh, early days, right in like March when things first shut down, the average number of staff retained was about 15% across the industry. And according to our July survey, gyms are currently employing about 67% of their full-time staff and about 42% of their part-time staff. There are a number of people, around a little bit over 40% of gyms, who've reduced the number of hours for their full-time staff and part-time staff. So that's another factor that might go into payroll expenses, depending on whether you're in a furlough situation or what sorts of agreements you've had with your employees. But this is the general average across all gyms, whether they're open or closed at the moment. So this includes everyone who responded to our survey. And again, those trends that we've seen, March, April, many gyms, about 15 to 20% of gyms were open, so about an 80+% closure rate. We had about 15% of the staff in the indoor climbing industry actively employed and working. Today, we're about 55% of the total indoor climbing staff that we would normally see this time last year working. So we're on an upward trend, and we're very similar to what we're seeing in the rest of the U.S. anyway. So give you guys some perspective there. Going back to McKinsey again, I found this to be a really interesting resource to compare and contrast our situation with everyone else's. I thought it'd be worth diving into customer sentiment and like what we could maybe be forecasting as we get further on into the hopefully recovery period of the pandemic soon. Still some pretty rough outlooks and some pretty and a lot of uncertainty in just the general customer sentiment in the U.S. And just to be clear, these for the next few slides on customer sentiment, most of this will be pulling directly out of the U.S. In some cases, there's similar data overseas, and in other cases, it doesn't really compare quite the same. So the good news for anyone who's international is all these U.S. numbers are going to look a little bit worse than what you're going to see in your country, whether that's Canada or anyone in Europe. So the U.S. is looking at some potential retraction in consumer spending in a bunch of different areas. But when it comes to fitness and wellness specifically, the data has been trending more positively, which is wonderful news for us. A couple other things that you could pay attention to in addition to McKinsey, if you're trying to get a glimpse of what the general customer sentiment might be in your area. Yelp has a great site called the Yelp Economic Average, and they crunch a lot of data that they get based on a proprietary algorithm as always, but looking at the number of views to different types of sites, the number of searches they get from the homepage, the number of reviews and comments and check-ins they get. And in June, there was a pretty stark uptick in gyms, and that would include fitness gyms and indoor climbing gyms and several other wellness and fitness types of businesses. So we've seen a little bit of a return to active life, and I think a few other reporting agencies out there are showing similar trends. So one thing we might look forward to, it's hard to be sure about this, but as we do enter more firmly into the recovery period, people might be more eager to be getting back into these types of activities that they've been missing out on for so many months, climbing especially. So this McKinsey data on the left here, that's from just a little bit earlier in August, they published this, and there was a 16%, this is asking consumers what their intention is for spending on certain categories, and there's a whole bunch of different categories, as you might imagine. I just pulled out the most relevant for us. So as of early August, late July, according to McKinsey, about 50% of people are expecting the next 6 to 12 months to be spending about the same amount of money that they're spending now on fitness. About 16% of people are expecting to spend more on fitness and wellness, and about 34% are looking at maybe trying to save some money there, depending on their household finances. One of the important points about that little graph is that that's actually an increase of 22% in customer expectations over the previous month. So we're seeing a growing trend, even though the overall spending intent index is a little bit negative. I think that we'll keep an eye on that, and we might see that continue to grow as people get more and more comfortable with the new protocols and feeling more safe in the types of environments that you guys have created for them. Another really interesting tool that you guys can use, and again, this is US data here, but Google has been publishing what they are calling their mobility trends, and this is big data kind of stuff coming in from tracking people's cell phones and where they're spending the most, where that cell phone stops for the most amount of time, also using their reviews and searches in Google Maps and on their website as well. So I just put this up to compare us to a number of different industries. And again, this is for the US, but if you go to this mobility tool for Google, you can fine tune that to almost every country in the world. And in most countries, you can fine tune that to specific regions and or cities, depending on the size of the country. So in the US, you can actually crunch this data all the way down to, I believe, the county level, and in some cases, the city level. So you can go in there and get a big giant data file and see what's happening in your really immediate area that's surrounding your gym, and you might be able to make some more educated choices on how you're marketing to people, who you're marketing to, or possibly when you start certain marketing campaigns. And the way this mobility tool with Google works is that it's comparing the same point in time last year. So very similar to what we're doing with the CWA's surveys. So any of these data points on this map would be saying, okay, so August 1st, there are X number of people visiting recreation sites. However, Google has decided to define that. And at this point in year, on August 1st, there's about a 15% decrease in the number of visits. Um, and one of the reasons I surfaced this is it's not obviously great news in terms of like looking at overall, we're doing better than last year, but we're also not doing, at least in the ways that people are moving around the world, are not doing wholly bad. um, we're only seeing a 15% decrease for the last month or so, the last 4 or 5 weeks, and it's plateaued pretty steadily with maybe just a very slight growth. But you can compare that to, back in March and April when people, we were down 50% from the normal traffic to those types of businesses. And I should say that recreation tab does include retail as well. Google doesn't break it out beyond recreation and retail, so it's a bit of a mixed category. But I think it does serve as one useful indicator that's publicly and really easily available to you guys to play around with. So I was just thanking you guys for indulging us in that time in the breakout rooms. That kind of networking and chance to meet people in different parts of their journey through the indoor climbing industry, and to share ideas and knowledge is a big part of what we're trying to do with this workshop, as well as give you guys some concrete tools as well to work on your business. And so that's a really similar experience to what you guys would be seeing when you join us next week. I think many of you have already registered and are going to be with us next week. Um, if you haven't, hopefully you do, and we'll see you over there. You can just join at any time at climbingwallindustry.org/survive. And then I was just going to give you a little sneak preview of what that platform is going to look like. Uh, Even though there's just 2 days of live workshop content, this whole platform will be available for 6 months, and you'll have access to recordings of that content, and you'll have access to all of the collaborating and networking opportunities that we've been setting up for you guys, as well as some of the business tools as well. So the platform looks like this. You can navigate around, see who else is attending, set up networking groups with them. Um, you can really quickly have one-on-one video interactions like we're doing right now with just a couple clicks. You can join meeting rooms, catch up with people, and you can also visit some of the great sponsors we have joining us, um, and see what they have going on. As you guys reopen, there's going to be a lot of interesting things to learn about, and there'll be some really great promotions that our sponsors and exhibitors will have for you as well. For example, we at the CWA, we're going to do a raffle, give you guys free tickets to our next virtual event. So hopefully we see you over there. It's going to be really a really great workspace. I'm excited to see it all come together, and we all have to figure out how to live in this new world, and how to best support each other. I think this is going to be one of the big steps that we can do to give you guys some more long-term collaboration and information than we get a chance to on these short 1 hour community calls, which we've enjoyed hosting so much, and hopefully you guys have enjoyed attending. Um, but we'll end this one for today. Unless you guys have any other questions, feel free to raise your hand. But you can always contact us directly, catch recordings of all these calls on our Coronavirus Resource Hub. And as we get this next reopening survey out to you guys, please take a chance to fill that out. That really helps us keep track of everything that's going on. So thanks again for joining us today, and I'll let you guys get on with the rest of your day. And I'll see you at the Survive and Thrive workshop next week. Bye.